My phone started vibrating across the hotel nightstand at 2:07 in the morning. "Dad," I answered on the fourth ring. "Your apartment building is on fire," Richard said before I could speak. "Hope you have insurance." There was no panic in his voice, no fear that his daughter might be trapped inside apartment 4B. If anything, he sounded satisfied. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I did not scream. I did not gasp. I sat up in my temporary hotel bed 3 blocks away, where I had been staying during the scheduled electrical overhauls, and calmly reached for my tablet. Panic is a useless emotion. Anger was not loud this time. It was entirely clinical. I booted up the industrial monitoring console. The glowing interface of the telemetry dashboard loaded in 2 seconds. I bypassed the standard tenant portal and entered my encrypted administrator credentials. The data fed into the screen in a steady, reassuring stream. The telemetry from the Mercer Ridge lofts confirmed that the industrial suppression system had activated at exactly 2:01 in the morning inside the basement utility corridor. The fire department had been dispatched automatically by the smart grid. Sensor data indicated that all 16 residential units had been successfully evacuated without injury. A short, cold laugh escaped my lips. It echoed in the quiet hotel room, sharp and metallic. On the other end of the line, the sound deeply unsettled my father. "What is so funny?" Richard demanded, his voice suddenly losing its smug edge. "Why are you laughing?" I stared at the glowing numbers on my screen. The emergency dispatch had not even cleared the primary channels yet. There was absolutely no public way for him to know the specific details of the incident unless he was actively involved. My mind processed the timeline like a forensic balance sheet. He knew about the fire before the authorities had officially registered the scale of the event. He was gloating prematurely. I did not ask him how he knew. I simply pulled up the unalterable cloud server access log for the building's physical security system. I filtered the data for the past hour. There it was, sitting in plain sight like a glaring accounting error. At exactly 1:43 in the morning, a decommissioned administrative key code had been swiped at the basement utility door. It was Richard's old code. The puzzle solved itself in milliseconds. This was not a breakdown. It was a flawless audit, and he had just handed me the final piece of evidence. I ended the call without another word. There was no need for a dramatic farewell or an emotional confrontation. The digital data was absolute. The timeline was perfect, and the liability was entirely his. I grabbed my trench coat, slipped into my boots, and headed for the hotel elevator. The ride down to the lobby was silent, perfectly matching the calculated quiet I had maintained for the past 6 months. This retaliation had not been born tonight. It had been meticulously constructed over time. For over 5 years, Richard had paraded around family dinners, treating me like an incompetent dependent. He loved to perform the role of the benevolent patriarch, loudly reminding everyone that I was renting apartment 4B strictly on his charity. Yet, in the privacy of his home office, that arrogance completely evaporated. He had spent those same 5 years actively exploiting my forensic accounting skills to clean up his disastrous tax returns and hide his mounting financial incompetence. I had been the silent investor in his version of fatherhood, footing the bill while he took the credit. 6 months ago, the facade shattered completely. During a routine audit of his files, I uncovered a stack of final foreclosure notices hidden at the bottom of his desk drawer. The numbers were staggering. Richard had recklessly leveraged the $4,200,000 property into high-risk commercial junk bonds. Predictably, he had defaulted on everything. The building was sinking, and he was dragging all 16 families down with him. When I confronted him with the paperwork, offering a structured path to liquidation, he did not show gratitude. Instead, he sneered, puffing out his chest with unearned authority. He told me I understood spreadsheets, not real estate, and ordered me to stay out of his business. That was the exact moment my familial affection converted into a binding contract, one where I immediately canceled my subscription to his illusions. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear or ask why. I simply went back to my laptop and began the acquisition process. I refused to bail him out. Instead, I quietly formed an anonymous corporate entity named Mercer Crest Holdings, LLC. Operating through total corporate privacy, I bypassed him entirely and negotiated directly with the institutional noteholder. Backed by my private investment portfolio alongside an institutional commercial facility, I bought the distressed debt at a public commercial auction for exactly $1,850,000. Richard had absolutely no idea. I became his landlord overnight. Securing the deed was only step one of the ledger. I immediately allocated $240,000 into comprehensive infrastructure improvements. That capital funded the industrial-grade sprinkler systems and the encrypted telemetry network that had just saved the building tonight. Richard thought I was a naive tenant living on his grace. He had no idea I was the sovereign owner, actively fortifying the complex against his inevitable collapse. As I stepped out of the elevator and into the cool night air, the final pieces of his financial ruin were perfectly aligning. This was not revenge. This was precise accounting, and his balance was entirely depleted. I walked with purpose, my mind sharp and clear, calculating the exact sequence of events that would unfold in the next hour. The ledger was finally closing. I arrived at the rain-drenched scene in downtown Seattle under the blinding, flashing strobe lights of 3 massive fire engines. The midnight air smelled sharply of ozone and damp asphalt. Richard was already positioned on the sidewalk, holding court with a shivering group of evacuated tenants, former maintenance staff, and my younger brother, Logan. True to form, Richard was aggressively performing for his captive audience. Playing the deeply aggrieved patriarch, he paced the wet pavement and loudly blamed the catastrophic incident on reckless outside investors who let the building rot. He spoke with the false authority of a man absolutely desperate to rewrite reality before the smoke even cleared. As I confidently approached the perimeter, Richard spotted me. His eyes darted nervously before rapidly hardening into their usual dismissive glare. He stepped forward and physically grabbed my forearm, his grip tight and aggressive, attempting to physically steer me away from the crowd. "You are a tenant," he barked, deliberately projecting his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Management issues are not your concern. Do not make accusations you cannot afford." I stared down at his hand, gripping my trench coat. This was his signature strategy. For decades, Richard's severe narcissism had operated on a highly specific frequency, creating a psychological trap of normalized cruelty. He relied entirely on the assumption that ingrained familial loyalty would force his victims into silent compliance. In his mind, systematic financial exploitation and public humiliation were simply routine family business. He had intentionally conditioned his children to accept a distorted reality where his abuse of control was disguised as paternal protection, and any resistance was framed as an ungrateful betrayal. The entire family structure was a toxic ecosystem designed exclusively to sustain his fragile ego while steadily bankrupting everyone else's self-worth. Logan stood a few feet away, his eyes cast downward, perfectly demonstrating the silent paralysis that this normalized cruelty inevitably breeds. But I was no longer a participant in his ecosystem. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was intensely clinical. I did not flinch, and I did not lower my voice. I simply looked from his tightening fingers directly up to his panicked eyes. He was not shocked by the arson he had attempted tonight. He was shocked that I was no longer playing along. The business transaction of our relationship had officially defaulted. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single shred of regret for the man standing before me, but there was only pure clarity. I pulled my arm out of his grasp with a sharp, decisive motion. The curbside court he had arrogantly assembled was about to witness a brutal restructuring of management. I stared at Richard's hand until he slowly released his grip, his fingers opening one by one under the weight of my absolute cold indifference. I did not waste a single syllable on him. Instead, I turned my back and walked directly toward the lead fire investigator, who was conferring with his tactical team near the main entrance. I presented my encrypted administrator keycard, legally verifying my supreme operational clearance level. Without a moment of hesitation, I opened my tablet and pulled up the unalterable cloud server access log. I handed the glowing screen directly to the investigator. The digital evidence was entirely irrefutable. The investigator traced his heavy finger along the screen, audibly verifying the raw data for the official record. An administrative override code explicitly assigned to Richard Bennett had successfully unlocked the primary electrical vault at exactly 1:43 in the morning. Richard, who had frantically followed me to intercept the conversation, instantly turned a sickly, translucent shade of pale. His arrogant performance crumbled as raw panic firmly set in. He immediately began blustering, his voice cracking as he frantically claimed that digital codes easily get copied by disgruntled former employees. He puffed out his chest and doubled down on his delusion, loudly insisting that he still possessed the physical master keys because he definitively owns the place. The investigator did not entertain his desperate, transparent deflection. He looked up from the tablet, his expression hardening into absolute professional disdain. He stated clearly, for everyone standing nearby to hear, that this was not an accidental power surge or an organic system failure. The physical evidence remaining inside the utility room proved undeniable, calculated sabotage. The primary circuit breakers had been deliberately and expertly bridged with heavy copper shunt bars. The setup was meticulously engineered to bypass all physical safety failsafes and forcibly induce a highly catastrophic arc flash. The digital noose had firmly tightened. Richard's fragile alibi disintegrated in real time before my eyes. The digital timeline of the override code perfectly matched the manual installation of the copper shunt bars. He had not just let the building rot, he had actively attempted to execute a devastating commercial disaster. I stood perfectly still, silently watching his pathetic attempts to rewrite the unchangeable facts. There was no despair or grief in my chest, only the precise satisfaction of a complex equation finally balancing out. The forensic evidence was absolute, the motive was apparent, and the severe consequences were rapidly accelerating. Richard was no longer a father dealing with a disobedient tenant. He was a primary suspect, securely locked inside an airtight forensic trap. The freezing rain continued to steadily wash over the cracked pavement as the lead fire investigator methodically closed his weather-resistant notepad. He stepped closer, looking directly at Richard, and calmly brought up the name Garrick Vance. He casually mentioned that an unlicensed, rogue electrical technician matching Vance's specific physical description had been clearly spotted loitering near the restricted basement alleyway around midnight. Richard's remaining sliver of composure entirely shattered. In his absolute blind panic to desperately distance himself from the timeline, he completely abandoned all basic logic. His face flushed a dark, guilty crimson as he aggressively blurted out a fatal, unforced Freudian slip. "I did not pay Garrick to start a fire." The investigator tilted his head, his voice immediately dropping to a low, chillingly authoritative register. "Nobody said anyone started a fire, and I certainly never mentioned that Garrick Vance was paid." The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. Richard realized his monumental, self-incriminating error a fraction of a second too late. The investigator then efficiently delivered the crushing reality of the current tactical situation. He revealed that Garrick Vance was actually already sitting securely in police custody. Garrick had folded immediately during his initial precinct questioning and had fully, officially confessed. He admitted on record that Richard had explicitly paid him $15,000 to deliberately trigger a catastrophic electrical blowout. The entire criminal objective was to engineer a structural disaster massive enough to terrify the anonymous new owner into immediately selling the distressed property back at a devastating financial loss. Richard had clumsily outsourced his sabotage, and his hired hand had flipped instantly under pressure. But my methodical retaliation was not yet finished. It was finally time to permanently close the accounting books. I stepped forward, holding a secure waterproof folder containing the secondary twist of the night. Earlier that week, my automated forensic alerts had flagged an unauthorized credit application using my social security number. I had let the transaction clear silently, monitoring the funds as they moved directly toward Garrick Vance's account. This was the lethal financial discovery I had printed and locked in my briefcase days ago, waiting for this exact moment. I handed the verified banking records directly to the investigator. Forensic banking records absolutely do not lie, and Richard had left a glowing, undeniable digital wire trail. The documents showed exactly how he had illicitly sourced the $15,000 to pay Garrick. He had wired the funds directly from a highly fraudulent corporate credit line. However, he had not used his own ruined credentials to secure the loan. He had opened the illicit account by maliciously using my stolen social security number. He had literally tried to weaponize my identity to secretly fund the fiery destruction of my own property. This was no longer a localized civil case of property damage or simple reckless negligence. By illegally utilizing my personal identification to secure fraudulent capital across state lines, Richard had instantly elevated the incident into a severe federal crime. He had committed textbook federal identity theft and aggressively combined it with premeditated commercial arson. I clinically watched him process the sheer magnitude of the felony charges stacking up against him. My affection had been a blind subscription, and he had spent years charging fraudulent emotional and financial purchases to my account. Tonight, the final balance was due in full. The cold, mechanical reality of the law was permanently closing in around him. The sleek headlights of a black town car cut sharply through the freezing rain, pulling smoothly up to the curb. My retained corporate real estate attorney, Marcus Sterling, stepped out into the night. He was impeccably dressed despite the late hour, carrying a thick, notarized corporate portfolio securely under his arm. Richard, desperately clinging to the fading ghost of his fractured authority, immediately attempted to assert loud, aggressive control. He pointed a trembling finger at Marcus and loudly ordered him off the property, arrogantly claiming that unauthorized lawyers had absolutely no business trespassing at his residential complex. Marcus did not even blink. He calmly bypassed Richard entirely, stepping purposefully beside me to officially address the authorities and the gathering crowd. With clinical, uncompromising precision, Marcus officially addressed the officers. For the record, Mercer Crest Holdings LLC is wholly and exclusively owned by Senior Forensic Auditor Brooke Bennett. I smoothly opened the leather portfolio Marcus handed me, carefully extracting the registered title and the finalized property deeds. I held them out, letting the undeniable legal reality of the paperwork settle heavily over the chaotic scene. Richard was instantly paralyzed. His eyes frantically darted across the official county recorder stamps and my clearly printed name. The devastating realization hit him with undeniable physical force. His daughter, the tenant he constantly belittled, was the sole sovereign owner of the entire complex. I had personally funded the massive life safety upgrades and the advanced suppression systems that had just effortlessly defeated his arson attempt and saved 16 innocent families. This was the ultimate, brutal exposure of the illusion of power of an empty wallet. For years, Richard's domestic authority had been entirely performative. It was a hollow theatrical display built exclusively on massive borrowed debt, verbal intimidation, and profound financial illiteracy. He foolishly equated loud demands and unearned arrogance with genuine structural power. But power without actual capital, integrity, or competence is just a fragile, temporary illusion. His loud, empty wallet completely crumbled the exact second it was forced to stand against genuine financial competence, rigorous forensic accounting, and unassailable legal ownership. I had not bothered to argue with his delusions. I had simply bought the very ground he was arrogantly standing on. As the crushing reality of his total displacement set in, 2 Seattle police officers moved in seamlessly from the perimeter. They stepped firmly behind Richard, expertly securing his wrists and placing him in cold steel handcuffs right there on the wet, illuminated curb. His blustering protests instantly died in his throat, replaced only by the humiliating mechanical click of the locking mechanism. Logan, standing nearby in the rain, finally broke his deeply conditioned paralysis. He stepped forward, his voice cracking as he tearfully apologized to me. He openly confessed his deep regret for silently enabling our father's relentless lies and looking the other way while I was systematically exploited. I offered him a brief, curt nod. Forgiveness was a complex transaction reserved for another day. Meanwhile, the displaced tenants began to respectfully gather around us. One by one, they expressed their profound gratitude, thanking me for quietly upgrading the building's safety systems and actively protecting their homes from total destruction. I had legally secured my assets, protected the innocent, and forcefully liquidated the toxic criminal liability that was my father. Exactly 3 weeks later, the necessary structural repairs on the utility corridor at the Mercer Ridge lofts were fully and successfully completed. I officially retained an independent, highly professional property management firm to handle the daily logistical operations and tenant relations of the complex. With the property asset fully stabilized and projected to generate steady, long-term revenue, I packed up my personal belongings and moved out of apartment 4B on my own absolute terms. The building remained securely in my investment portfolio as a highly profitable commercial asset. Meanwhile, Richard sat isolated in a cold county holding cell, facing multiple severe felony indictments, federal identity theft charges, and total, inescapable financial ruin. I have come to realize that some familial ledgers simply cannot be balanced with blind loyalty. Society conditions us to believe that toxic ties must be maintained because of shared DNA, urging us to absorb the damage at the expense of our own sanity. But severing ties with a destructive parent is not cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You do not owe your future to those who only see you as collateral. Standing there under the city lights, I felt no sorrow, only the quiet power of a closed chapter. I survived his fire, but more importantly, I permanently extinguished the source of the flames. The transition from a silent victim to a sovereign owner did not happen by accident. It was built on meticulous accounting, undeniable professional competence, and a firm refusal to be a silent investor in my own destruction. If this story reminded you that true independence is perfectly built on verifiable receipts, genuine competence, and self-respect, not toxic family loyalty, share this video, drop your story in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel.